I have exited Discovery. I'm a free agent. What?
There's a certain kind of man who builds his entire identity around speed. Not just the speed of engines or the rush of a quarter mile, but the speed of life itself. Moving fast, deciding fast, spending fast, and sometimes falling fast. Richard Rawlings has always been that kind of man. And for years, the rumors swirled around him like exhaust smoke at a burnout competition. People whispered about why his show really ended. They talked about the marriages, the legal battles, the auctioned-off cars, and the sudden shifts in direction that left even his most loyal fans scratching their heads. But at 55 years old, Richard Rawlings has finally started filling in the blanks. And the full picture? It's a lot more complicated, and a lot more human, than anyone expected. To understand where Richard Rawlings stands today, you have to go back to where he started. Not the TV version of the beginning, but the real one. The one that happened long before cameras and contracts and cable deals. Richard was born on March 30th, 1969, in Fort Worth, Texas. He grew up in a working-class household where money was never something you took for granted. His father worked multiple jobs simultaneously, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, just to keep things afloat. But no matter how stretched thin the budget got, his dad always made sure to have one thing for himself, a car or a motorcycle. That single luxury in an otherwise tight existence sent a message to young Richard that stuck with him for the rest of his life. Some things are worth working for. Some things you don't compromise on. From the time he was old enough to ride along, Richard was out before sunrise helping his father deliver newspapers. They'd be up at 3 in the morning, rolling stacks of papers, driving through quiet neighborhoods while the rest of the city slept. After school, he'd go out again for the afternoon edition. On weekends, he rode his bike collecting payments from customers. It was unglamorous work, but it taught him discipline, independence, and an eye for detail. During those early morning and late afternoon rounds, he started cataloging every car in every driveway. He knew the make, the model, the year. He knew which neighbor had just gotten something new and which one had been driving the same rusted-out sedan for a decade. It wasn't obsession. It was observation turning into expertise without anyone realizing it. By the time he was 14 years old, Richard Rawlings had already bought his first car. It was 1983. The car was a 1974 Mercury Comet, painted in a shade of green that most people would have passed right over. He bought it with money he had saved himself. Years of newspaper routes and weekend collections turned into cold, hard cash handed over for a vehicle he technically wasn't old enough to legally drive. That didn't stop him. He was already burning rubber in school parking lots, doing donuts, making his classmates remember the name Richard Rawlings before they even really knew who he was. That Comet was ugly to most people. To him, it was everything. And more importantly, it was proof. Proof that if you worked hard enough and wanted something badly enough, you could make it happen. By his senior year, he had already been through several vehicles. Each one bought, modified, and sold for a profit. He had flipped nearly 20 cars before graduation, not as a hobby, but as a business. He was developing skills that business schools charge thousands of dollars to try to teach. Negotiation. Valuation. The psychology of a buyer who wants to believe they're getting a deal. He wasn't guessing at any of it. He had an instinct that was being sharpened every single time money changed hands. But before Gas Monkey, before the cameras, before any of it, Richard Rawlings wore a different kind of uniform. Between 1988 and 1990, he worked as a police officer, a firefighter, and a paramedic. All before he was 21 years old. Most people don't know that part of the story. They see the tattoos and the big personality and the swagger that fills a television frame, and they don't picture a young man in a police uniform serving the community in Alvarado, Texas, or suiting up as a firefighter in Capel. But that's exactly who he was. His father's voice in his head, get a steady job, build something stable, earn your retirement, drove him into those roles. And for a while, he honored that instinct. The change came unexpectedly, the way the most important changes often do. He was delivering beer to a local bar when a regular customer asked him what he wanted to do with his life. Richard mentioned law enforcement but admitted he couldn't afford the academy. The customer, who turned out to be the mayor of a nearby city, told him he'd take care of it. Within 17 days, Richard was enrolled at the North Texas Police Academy. It was a reminder that the right conversation at the right moment could change everything. He carried that lesson with him forever. Still, by his mid-20s, the pull of something bigger was impossible to ignore. He sold everything he owned and headed to California in a Jeep, chasing a version of himself that didn't yet exist. 6 months later he came back to Texas with tattoos, pierced ears, no Jeep, it had been repossessed, and not much else. He slept on his sister's couch. It was one of the lowest points of his life. But it was also the moment that clarified everything. He wasn't built for someone else's plan. He was built to build his own. In 1999, he launched a printing and advertising company called Lincoln Press in Dallas. He had no background in the printing industry whatsoever. What he had was an understanding of branding, attention, and what made people remember a name. He secured a $100,000 small business loan and got to work. Within a few years, Lincoln Press was doing serious volume. In 2004, he made a bet that most business owners would have considered reckless. He offered a Lamborghini Gallardo to the first client who spent $1 million with the company. The stunt worked. It generated buzz, landed clients, and proved something Richard had always believed. People respond to boldness. They remember it. They talk about it. And that talking becomes marketing you can't buy. Eventually he sold Lincoln Press. And the money from that sale became the seed money for the thing he had been building toward his entire life. Gas Monkey Garage opened in Dallas in 2002, but the early years were nothing like what television would later show the world. There was no air conditioning. There was no running water. There were barely enough tools to do the work that needed doing. What there was Richard Rawlings showing up every single day and refusing to accept that the dream wasn't going to happen. He hit the road. Car shows, trade events, rallies. Anywhere there were people who loved cars, he was there, shaking hands and putting the Gas Monkey name in front of anyone who would listen. It was slow, grinding, exhausting work. And for years, it didn't look like it was going to pay off the way he needed it to. He pitched his idea for a television show repeatedly. Networks weren't interested. The concept felt too niche, too risky, too hard to sell to a broad audience. He kept going anyway. Then, in May 2007, Richard Rawlings did something that would change the trajectory of his career in a way that no amount of pitching ever could. He and his friend Dennis Collins set out to break the Cannonball Run record, the legendary coast-to-coast drive from New York City to Los Angeles. The original record, set back in 1979, had stood for nearly 3 decades at 32 hours and 51 minutes. Rawlings and Collins drove a modified Ferrari 550 Maranello fitted with extra fuel tanks to minimize stops. They left Manhattan in the middle of the night and arrived at the Portofino Inn in Redondo Beach, California just 31 hours and 59 minutes later, averaging 87.6 miles per hour across more than 2,800 miles of American road. The record stood. And the recognition that followed was significant. Jay Leno, one of the most respected figures in the entire automotive world, acknowledged what Rawlings had done. In a world where anyone can claim anything, a nod from Jay Leno meant something real. It meant the car community was watching. It meant Richard Rawlings had credibility that extended beyond just the local Dallas garage scene. When Discovery Channel finally said yes in 2012 and Fast and Loud premiered on June 6 of that year, it detonated. The show wasn't built for car enthusiasts alone. It was built for everyone. Families, kids, grandparents, people who had never owned anything more interesting than a used sedan but found themselves completely hooked on watching a team of mechanics transform forgotten machines back into something extraordinary. Rawlings described his vision for the show exactly that way. Something grandparents and grandchildren could watch together on a Sunday afternoon. The formula worked in a way that surprised even the people who greenlit it. The show ran for 16 seasons and 155 episodes. It was translated into 13 languages and broadcast in over 200 countries. That kind of reach doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a concept is genuinely universal, when the theme of finding hidden value in something broken and making it shine again resonates with something deep in the human experience. And Rawlings understood that intuitively. He wasn't just restoring cars. He was telling stories. Every rusted shell that rolled into the gas monkey garage had a history, and watching that history get honored and then amplified was addictive television. His business formula, what he often called the cash money approach, was built on speed and instinct. He would travel across the country, sometimes carrying tens of thousands of dollars in cash, ready to close a deal on the spot before a seller had time to think twice or call another buyer. He understood something that most people don't fully appreciate about negotiation. Hesitation is the enemy of a good deal. If you show up with real money and real conviction, you change the psychological dynamic completely. He once summarized it simply by saying that if you've got the cash in your pocket, you can often buy a $10,000 car for $5,000. That was his philosophy. And it worked on screen because it worked in real life first. One of the most striking examples of that formula playing out was a Dodge Challenger restoration that the show documented in detail. Rawlings bought the car for just over $40,000. The team invested $77,000 into the build, custom work, performance upgrades, the kind of attention to detail that transforms a vehicle from a car into a statement. When it sold, the buyer paid $150,000, a profit of $73,000 on a single transaction. That wasn't luck. That was the result of accumulated knowledge about what the market wanted, what buyers responded to emotionally, and how to create something that felt worth the premium. But success on that scale always comes with friction. And for Richard Rawlings, the friction arrived in a very public and very expensive way in 2018. When Gas Monkey Bar and Grill filed a $6 million defamation lawsuit against him. The lawsuit accused Rawlings of deliberately attempting to undermine his business partners through what the legal filing described as a systematic pattern of deceit and interference. The document ran 47 pages. It painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly difficult to work with as his celebrity status grew, showing up uninvited, contradicting staff decisions, making accusations of financial mismanagement that the bar's management said were entirely without basis. According to the lawsuit, the problems had started as early as May 2013, before the bar even opened. A former employee reportedly described Rawlings's behavior toward construction workers in terms that were damning, comparing his conduct to that of a spoiled teenager, apparently so disruptive that he was at one point banned from the construction site entirely. After the bar opened, the conflicts continued. Staff were undermined. Vendors were spooked. In 2015, Rawlings sent a written accusation suggesting that financial records had gone missing, implying fraud or theft. The bar's managing member invited him immediately to come review the records in person. Rawlings declined and doubled down on the accusation. He later apologized and attributed his behavior to drinking, an admission that raised more questions than it answered. In 2017, when a potential buyer came forward interested in acquiring the Gas Monkey Bar brand, Rawlings allegedly made additional public accusations of financial mismanagement that killed the deal. When the lawsuit landed in 2018, it wasn't just a business dispute. It was a signal that something had been going seriously wrong beneath the surface of the Gas Monkey brand for years. The $6 million figure was staggering. The details were embarrassing. And the timing, right as Fast and Loud was still airing and Rawlings was at the height of his public profile, made it impossible to ignore. Rawlings fired back. On March 28, 2019, he filed a $1 million countersuit alleging copyright infringement, claiming that the bar had continued using the Gas Monkey name and branding after their licensing agreement had expired. His legal team argued that not only had the bar failed to renew the rights, but that the brand was being used to promote events he described as lewd and inappropriate, events that, in his view, actively damaged the Gas Monkey name and his personal reputation. He had sent a cease and desist letter the previous month, giving the bar 10 days to comply. When they didn't, he went to court. The legal war between Rawlings and his former business partners became one of the messiest public disputes in the custom car world's recent history. Fans were divided. Some felt Rawlings had been wronged by partners who exploited his name after their agreement ended. Others felt the lawsuit painted a portrait of a man who had let fame and money distort his judgment and his relationships. The truth, as it almost always is, probably lives somewhere in the complicated middle. What the lawsuit, and the way it unfolded publicly, revealed was something Rawlings himself has since been more candid about: the darker side of building an empire fast. When your brand becomes bigger than yourself, when your name is on restaurants and venues and energy drinks and concert halls, the distance between the person you are and the business you've built can grow in ways that become dangerous. The Gas Monkey brand had expanded at extraordinary speed, and at some point, the cracks in those foundations started to show. His personal life during these years told a parallel story. Rawlings had been married twice before the legal battles consumed his public narrative. First, briefly, in 1993, to a woman named Karen who disappeared from the headlines almost as quickly as the marriage itself. That union lasted less than a year. He tried again in 1999 with Suzanne Marie Merrill, a marriage that lasted 10 years before ending in divorce in 2009. Then, in a move that fascinated people who followed his life, he and Suzanne reconciled and remarried in 2015 in Cabo San Lucas. It seemed like a second chance. Two people who knew each other's worst qualities deciding to try again anyway. It didn't last. In March 2019, Rawlings announced their second separation publicly on Twitter. His reasoning was candid. Media outlets were already covering it, so he wanted his fans to hear it from him directly. He described the decision as mutual. He said they still cared for each other after more than 20 years of being in and out of each other's lives. The financial settlement was significant: $300,000 paid out in 2 parts, plus Suzanne keeping her Mercedes. It was a quiet ending to a very long, very complicated love story. Not long after, Rawlings began a relationship with Katarina Deason, a woman whose background was almost cinematic in its contrast to the world of custom cars and garage builds. Katarina had previously been married to Darwin Deason, a Texas billionaire whose company, Affiliated Computer Services, had sold to Xerox for $6 billion. Her previous life had included private jets, superyachts, and the kind of wealth that exists at a level most people never encounter. In 2019, she and Richard started dating. On August 17th of that year, he proposed at a resort in Tulum, Mexico, with rose petals on the beach and a social media post declaring he had found his soulmate. They married on June 28, 2020 in Key West, Florida. A small ceremony necessitated by a pandemic that had already forced them to cancel their planned wedding in Greece. The year 2020 was transformational in multiple directions. Fast and Loud aired its final episode on June 8 after 16 seasons. The show didn't get cancelled in the traditional sense. Rawlings made the decision himself, and he was direct about why. He went on the Joe Rogan Experience and laid it out plainly. He had left Discovery. He wanted creative control. He didn't want to be locked into contractual arrangements that limited where he could go next. In an industry built on the appearance of freedom, he was finally choosing the real thing. The departure left a gap, but Rawlings moved quickly to fill it. He launched a podcast called Monkey Trap, which gave him a direct line to his audience without the mediation of a network. He brought in guests from across industries, including Hollywood stuntman Cord Newman, and used the platform to tell the stories that a cable show's format never had space for. He stayed engaged with the car community through YouTube and social media, building an audience that followed the man rather than the network. Then came the auction. In September 2023, Rawlings made a move that turned heads across the collector car world. He auctioned off nearly 30 vehicles from his personal collection through Bring a Trailer, the highly respected online auction platform known for attracting serious buyers. The total haul was just under $1.81 million. The highlights included a 1962 Chevrolet Corvette that brought $60,000, a 1965 Ford Mustang Fastback Code that sold for $75,000, and a rare 1993 Toyota Supra that led the entire auction at $121,000. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a liquidation, like someone stepping back from the life they had built. But Rawlings explained it differently. He said it was a strategic pivot, a deliberate decision to move away from what he described as beer budget cars and redirect his energy and his money toward high-end European collectibles. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, vintage machines from the 1970s and 80s that represented a different kind of automotive history than the American muscle cars that had made him famous. He backed up those words with action. During a trip to Ireland, he purchased 5 Ferrari Testarossas in a single transaction. One of those cars had been converted to an electric drivetrain and made a significant impression when it appeared at SEMA 2023. By early 2024, Rawlings had already reinvested more than $1 million into building his new collection. The direction had changed. The ambition had not. The Gas Monkey brand, meanwhile, kept evolving. The energy drink line that he had launched through licensing, smart enough not to take on the manufacturing costs himself, added new flavors. What had started as a 2-flavor product grew to include a tropical blend of mango, passion fruit, pineapple, lemon, and honey, formulated without high-fructose corn syrup or artificial additives. The drinks showed up at major motorsports events including the Indianapolis 500. The brand that began in a garage without running water was now visible at one of the most prestigious racing events in the world. So what are the rumors that Richard Rawlings, at 55, has finally confirmed? The honest answer is that the rumors were never one single thing. They were an accumulation, questions about why the show really ended, about what the legal battles said about who he really was behind the cameras, about whether the marriages failed because of something broken in him or simply because fame and ambition are genuinely incompatible with domestic stability, about whether the car sales meant he was in financial trouble or simply that he was evolving. What Rawlings has confirmed, through his actions and his own words in interviews and on social media over the past several years, is something more nuanced than any single revelation. He has confirmed that he drank too much for a period of his life, and that it affected his behavior and his relationships in ways he regrets. He has confirmed that the decision to leave Discovery was entirely his own, not a cancellation, not a firing, but a choice. He has confirmed that the marriages failed not because the women in his life weren't right for him, but because he was always chasing something that made it difficult to be fully present in the life that was actually happening around him. And he has confirmed, through every move he has made since 2020, that at 55, he isn't finished. The man who woke up at 3 in the morning as a boy to throw newspapers from a moving car, who survived a carjacking and a bullet wound and came back angrier and more determined, who slept on his sister's couch and turned that humiliation into rocket fuel, who built a global brand from a garage that didn't have air conditioning, that man is still running. Still buying. Still selling. Still chasing the next thing with the same urgency he brought to every car deal, every pitch, every handshake. Richard Rawlings at 55 is not the same person he was at 35 or 45. He has been through enough to change him, but the core of what he is has remained remarkably consistent through all of it. He is someone who believes that value hides in places most people aren't willing to look, that the real deal is usually underneath the rust, that if you show up with conviction and cash and the willingness to work, you can turn almost anything into something worth having. The rumors are confirmed. The story isn't over. And knowing Richard Rawlings, it's probably just getting interesting.